Welcome back to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today is Thanksgiving in the United States. It's a day to get together with family and friends and load up on about 5 pounds of turkey and dressing, sweet potatoes, mashed potatoes, green beans, maybe some mac and cheese, 2 or 3 different kinds of pie. If you observe Thanksgiving the way my family does, it's a day to celebrate plenty and enjoy spending a little time with family and maybe fall asleep in front of the football game after dinner. At least that's how we celebrate Thanksgiving today. Of course, you know damn well the real story isn't going to be that simple, and I'm just going to apologize in advance for my atrocious pronunciation of the Native American names in this episode. So here's the nice, friendly story you already know. The Plymouth colonists, in danger of starving because they didn't know how to feed themselves in Massachusetts, met up with the benevolent Wampanoag named Squanto, who showed them how to grow the right kinds of crops and how to care for them. And they had such a good harvest that they invited Squanto to bring his friends and celebrate the Pilgrims' good fortune with them. And they all got together and they gave thanks and they ate until they had to loosen their belts. And that's where the story pretty much always ends. It's a good story. Humans coming together as friends to take care of each other. Some of it's even true. Squanto really did help the Pilgrims out, and they really did share their harvest with the Wampanoag, even if they probably didn't eat turkey. But the story isn't quite as warm and fuzzy as we like to remember. Squanto, whose real name was Squantum, spoke English because he had been captured by slave traders in 1614 and taken to Europe. By the time he got back to his village in 1619, it was gone, wiped out by European diseases that swept through New England even before the Pilgrims got there. Some estimates say those diseases wiped out 3/4 or even more of the Native American population of New England. Now, I don't buy into such high estimates, but I'm not an expert in infectious diseases or Native American immunology. But even if it was as low as 1/3, we're talking about a plague on the level of the Black Death in Europe in the 1300s. And that's the low end of the estimates. Of course, those diseases weren't the Pilgrims' fault. And it was a good thing for the history of what would become the United States that Squantum was there to help them out. But it's dishonest to pretend that the history of relations between the European settlers and the Native Americans was mostly friendly, even in those early days. For example, I found one source that says the Pilgrims really didn't intend to share their harvest with the Wampanoag. But when they fired their weapons in the air to celebrate their great harvest in 1621, the Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, thinking things were about to go sideways, got his war band together. It wasn't until the war band showed up at Plymouth inquiring whether the colonists wanted to throw hands that they decided it'd be a good idea to have a feast to maybe diffuse the tension a little bit. Now, I have my suspicions about that story, mostly because the Puritans, the denomination the Pilgrims came from, really didn't think much of parties. And it seems a little irresponsible to me for them to have spent powder in that way. But the fact that Massasoit got his war band together tells me he didn't really trust the Pilgrims. Now, maybe he didn't trust anybody, but this situation just doesn't scream friendly relations to me. And things didn't get better over the next 300 years. Now, I'm not one of those guys who's gonna tell you the Native Americans were all living together in peace and harmony till white people showed up to fuck everything up. One of the reasons the early settlers and colonists were able to stay alive and push into the Native Americans' territory is because the tribes didn't need that much encouragement to go to war against each other. They weren't stupid, but they were human, just like us. And most of us have a hard time seeing what's going on when it doesn't match what we already believe. And however that first Thanksgiving went down, we didn't bother to make an annual holiday of it until 1863. That's when President Lincoln declared the 26th of November a national day of Thanksgiving. Before that, days of Thanksgiving were called by presidential proclamation and might happen at any time of the year. Since then, we've celebrated it every fall, and President Grant made it official in 1870. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you not to celebrate Thanksgiving. It's one of my favorite holidays. And what we did to the Native Americans as we spread across this continent wasn't your fault, and it wasn't mine, and if it hadn't happened, our country would look much different than it does today. But we're lying to ourselves when we pretend it was all peaceful, or all self-defense against white expansion or Native American aggression. People are messier than that. Which brings us to today's conflict, the Pequot War, one of the first wars European settlers fought on what would become United States soil. Whew, that might have been our longest intro yet. So the Pequot War started in 1636 and ended in 1638, a long time before anybody thought about anything like the United States of America. But it's part of our colonial history, and it shows a little bit of how complex these conflicts actually were. So first, as always, a little background. The Pequot were the dominant tribe in the Connecticut River Valley by the 1620s. They sold furs to the Dutch in exchange for metal, usually things like copper cooking pots and maybe some jewelry. The European traders and settlers tended to be pretty cautious about trading iron or modern weapons to the tribes. Then the English followed up the success of the Plymouth colony, that's the one the Pilgrims established in 1620, with a larger one in Massachusetts Bay in 1630. You've heard of that one, even if it doesn't sound familiar to you. We call it Boston today. And the English, with their two colonies, started to muscle in on the Dutch trade with the local tribes. Before long, many of the tribes learned they could get better deals with the English than they could with the Dutch. And what had been two European powers each trying to get a piece of the North American pie started to look more and more like a trade war, with the English trading and more or less allied with the Mohegan, and the Dutch trading and more or less allied with the Pequot. Now, trade wars in Europe, hell, most kinds of conflict really, tended to escalate into shooting wars. But out in the places Europe was colonizing, like South Asia and Africa and the Americas, it was usually much easier to shoot the Europeans' allies than the Europeans themselves. So they'd wait for an excuse, take out the rival's main trading partner, and enjoy the new market share. And that's pretty much what happened between the English and the Pequot. In 1634, members of a tribe allied with the Pequot, the Niantic, killed an English captain named John Stone and 7 of his guys. Now, I'm not going to go into it, but Stone was a piece of work, a pirate and a slaver, and pretty much nobody was going to miss him. But you can't just let the natives get away with killing a white guy. Then, in 1636, the same tribe killed an English trader named John Oldum. Again, not the kind of guy anybody was going to miss. I mean, they killed these folks for a reason, right? But the Massachusetts Bay Colony needed an excuse to weaken the Dutch by taking out the Pequot. So the governor sent John Endicott to Block Island, where Oldham had been killed, to demand the tribe surrender his killers. When they refused, he burned 3 villages, 1 Pequot and 2 allies, and headed to the house. Well, the Pequot, as you can imagine, weren't happy. They started raiding English settlements in the winter of 1636, killing settlers and their livestock and burning their farms. And this is where the war was pretty much decided, because an English exile named Roger Williams, who'd been living in Narragansett territory for several years by that time, persuaded them to side with the English instead of the Pequot. The Narragansett were one of the other dominant tribes in the region, and if they had sided with the Pequot, the two tribes together might have been able to drive the English out of Massachusetts. But with the Narragansett allied with the English against the Pequot, things looked much different. Remember what we said about turning the tribes against each other? Of course, it didn't look like a done deal in early 1637. So the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies called up their militias and got ready to march with their new Narragansett allies against the Pequot. And here we need to take a minute to talk about what a colonial militia looked like in New England in 1636 and 1637. Turns out these guys weren't really like the Minutemen of the Revolutionary War, farmers who grabbed their rifles when they heard the church bells ring. Now, these guys were pros, most of them veterans of the 30 Years' War, which raged in Europe from 1618 to 1648. Yes, they provided their own weapons and equipment, but they were soldiers, not farmers. Incidentally, and this has no bearing on the story, but this is the war the National Guard traces its formation to in the U.S. Which reminds me of a time I put my foot in my mouth a little bit. When I was in Iraq, I had the pleasure of working with a Scottish major for a couple of months. And one day, I was running my mouth about the National Guard tracing its roots all the way back to 1636. He turned to me and asked, and I'm not going to try to even do a Scottish accent here, but he turned to me and asked, "So is that when your regiment was formed?" Well, that shut me up, because of course the British Army has units that old, but we don't. I think I mumbled something that sounded a little bit like, "No, asshole." It just kind of drifted off to nurse my bruised ego. Which doesn't tell you anything about the Pequot War, but there it is. But the soldiers who formed up in New England in 1636 had to learn a whole different kind of war than what they had known in Europe. See, this was the age of what we call pike and shot in Europe. Muskets were only about 100 years old and still heavy as hell. And bayonets were very rare, and even if you had one, you couldn't fire your musket with it mounted because it mounted inside the barrel. So units in Europe generally had a combination of musketeers and pikemen armed with 16-foot pikes. The musketeers would fire until the lines got close or the cavalry charged, in which case the pikes were supposed to step forward and do the close-up work. Which is a pretty good solution in Europe, where battles are fought in open plains and both sides are looking to settle things with a decisive battle. But when you're fighting in the forest of New England, and your enemy is perfectly happy to nickel and dime you and hit your soft targets for years, instead of meeting you for a big fight that decides everything, well, a 16-foot spear doesn't do you much good in those kind of conditions. And sure enough, none of the sources I've seen says anything about pikes in these militia units. Which means these guys carried their heavy-ass muskets and probably a sidearm of some sort, like a long dagger or a sword. It's possible some of them were carrying hatchets by this time, but I couldn't find anything to confirm that. Hatchets and tomahawks were pretty common among American militia by the French and Indian War a century later, but I don't see them this early. And if you're a gun nerd, it looks like these guys mostly weren't using matchlock muskets, but more modern wheel lock and snap hands mechanisms. They didn't have flintlocks yet, but the snap hands was a similar concept with more moving parts. We'll talk about the difference one of these days when we talk about the evolution of gunpowder weapons. So the Pequot and Narragansett were armed pretty much as you'd expect. Bows and arrows, war clubs, spears, and hide shields. As I mentioned, the Europeans were careful not to trade them iron weapons, but they had figured out how to cut arrowheads out of the copper pots they got from the traders. So they did have some metal weapons. So that's why they were there and what they carried. Let's get to the fight. No shit, there they were. In addition to raiding English settlements around Massachusetts Bay, the Pequot, led by a man named Sassacus, responded to Endicott's raid by laying siege to Fort Saybrook, an English fort at the mouth of the Connecticut River where the town of Old Saybrook sits today. Starting in September 1636, any settlers who left the fort would be attacked. The Pequot killed livestock and destroyed any settlements and buildings outside the walls. Then when spring came, they tried to blockade the river to keep any aid from getting up to the settlements upstream. And on April 23rd, they attacked English settlers at Wethersfield, killing 9 men and 2 women and capturing 2 girls. Well, the colony couldn't let that kind of thing go unanswered. So they officially declared war on the Pequot on the 1st of May. They called up the militia, linked up with their Narragansett and Mohegan allies, and marched against a fortified Pequot village called Fort Mystic. They encircled the fort in a double ring, English troops on the inside and the Allies farther out, and attacked from both ends at once at dawn on the 26th of May. The Pequot inside the fort fought hard. A handful of militia were killed and about half went down wounded, but the Pequot never had a chance. Most of their warriors were off with Sassacus and the rest of the war band. The destruction of Fort Mystic was a preview of a pattern that would become common in the centuries to come. Something like 700 Pequot, mostly women and children, were killed, and the village burned to the ground. But the militia had a problem now. The attack had eaten up most of their ammo. They would only have been carrying 10 or 15 rounds apiece to start with, and they were short on food, and half of them were wounded. and they were in the middle of Pequot territory, and they weren't sure where the main Pequot army was. And Sassacus and his dudes were going to be pissed. And sure enough, the counterattack started later that day. Luckily for the English, the Pequot knew enough about their muskets that they weren't willing to get within range. So most of the attacks would have been quick hit-and-run deals instead of major attacks. But they managed, and when they saw the ships that were supposed to pick them up getting close to the Pequot River, 8 miles away, they managed to get everybody up and on their way. Well, the Pequot harassed and ambushed them all the way to the boats. The militia started firing volleys into any concealment they had to pass, like swamps and underbrush and thickets, to try and discourage these attacks. One of the English officers estimated more Pequot warriors died in their attacks on the retreating militia and their allies than they had killed in the attack on Mystic. But the militia made it back to Fort Saybrook, taking only a few more killed and wounded. The casualties the Pequot took in the massacre and the English retreat prompted them to abandon much of their territory. While most of the warriors stayed with Sassacus, about 3,500 people sought refuge with the neighboring tribes, who I imagine took them in but wondered how this thing was going to play out. Then in June, a Narragansett warband caught up with a Pequot warband somewhere in eastern Connecticut. We don't have details, but the Narragansett won that fight, dropping Sassacus' numbers even further. Then in July, the militia went hunting for Sassacus. 100 of them chased him into a swamp near Fairfield on the 13th. After a few hours of fighting, the English let the women and children surrender, but the warriors kept fighting through the night. Some reports say that some of the Pequot in this fight had muskets, so this may have been the first battle where Native Americans fought with firearms against whites. Then in the morning, something like 60 warriors managed to break out and escape the swamp. The English estimated they had killed between 7 and 60 Pequot. Hell of a range, but I guess nobody thought to count the bodies after the fight. Or nobody wanted to go into the swamp to do it. But Sassacus wasn't among the dead, or the 60 who escaped. He had slipped out before the militia reached the swamp, so he was still out there somewhere. But it turned out the militia didn't have to hunt him down. He ran west to modern-day New York, maybe looking to ask the Mohawk for help. But they killed him and sent his head and his hands, or maybe just his scalp, to the English. So that was it for Sassacus and for the Pequot War. We clearly don't have the whole story here because only about 200 Pequot survived the war. So either there were more massacres we don't know about, either because the Narragansett carried them out or the English didn't write about them, or the survivors were absorbed into the neighboring tribes and hidden. But of the 200 survivors the English knew about, mostly women and children, most of them were sold as slaves in the West Indies or given to the tribes allied with the English. Anybody left in the former Pequot territory was forbidden from calling themselves Pequot, and the colonial government declared the tribe extinct in the aftermath of the war. And business continued in the Connecticut River Valley, with the Mohegan and Narragansett taking up the dominant trading position the Pequot had occupied before. There's that English market share we talked about. Eventually, some Pequot came back to the Connecticut River Valley. These were either branches of the tribe who came in from other parts of New England, or probably some of the people who had fled to other tribes for shelter. But they never regained their former strength, as you might imagine. And eventually a reservation was established in Connecticut for their descendants. And less than half a century later, it was the Narragansetts' turn when they joined the Algonquian Confederacy against the English in King Philip's War in 1675. And you know how the story ends. By about 1900, pretty much all the Native American tribes had been subdued or wiped out. The surviving tribes collected in reservations that sit mostly in areas where white people didn't want to live. It wasn't a straight line progression, of course. It was messier than that. And there were plenty of examples of heroic and villainous behavior on both sides because, as far as I know, both sides were populated exclusively with humans. Except for the Mystic Massacre, we don't have enough detail on most of these battles to do a scorecard on. And I gotta be honest with you, I don't have the stomach to do a military analysis on a massacre like this. So no scorecard today. Sorry about that. Now, I don't mean to take away from your Thanksgiving by talking about massacres. As I said, it's one of my favorite holidays. I hope you enjoy your time with your family, whether it's the one you came from or the one you chose, because to me, that's the most important part of this holiday. Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed this war story, I hope you'll give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your nerdy friends about me. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Happy Thanksgiving.